here on the Chauncey DeVega Show, the one and only Reza Aslan.
When I was 14, I stayed out one night. Oh, mama.
How do you think this moment happened with Donald Trump? How was this man able to win the White House?
Well, look, I think that the United States has been undergoing a profound identity crisis over the last decade or so. In many ways, I think the election of Barack Obama was a clear indication of what that crisis looked like. Partly this has to do with the changing demographics in the United States, the changing racial landscape, the changing religious landscape. As you yourself know, demographers tell us that the United States of America will, sometime in the next couple of decades, become the first nation on earth to be majority minorities. And while for many of us, that is a cause for celebration. It's what makes this country so unique and miraculous in the way that it works. For many Americans, particularly those white Americans who have, in one way or another, benefited from the privileges that come with their particular skin tone or their immigrational primacy, this is a very scary thing. It's becoming more and more difficult to say with certainty what it means to be American. And as everyone knows, the easiest way to identify yourself is in opposition to an other. And so for a large swath of Americans who feel as though their very identity is under attack, they are desperately looking for scapegoats, for opposing forces to help them define who they are. And now here comes this racist, sexist, lecherous, pathologically lying fascist who very clearly outlines for them who they can scapegoat, who they can blame. And in many ways, what Trump has done is he's tapped into a sort of existential crisis, a foreboding lack of self-identity that is eating away at the heart of American culture. And he has galvanized that support in order to launch him into this disastrous presidency. The real issue here, the real shame of it all, isn't those who agree with Trump's racism and sexism and xenophobia and fear-mongering. The real shame of it all is those who disagree, but for whom it wasn't disqualifying, who seem to not care. The villain in this story, as far as history is concerned, is not Donald Trump. The villains are Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell. Those are the villains in this story.
So many things for us to talk about because you said, just your summary there, I've echoed the same things that Trump, again, is a pathological liar. He clearly is a fascist, even though so many quote-unquote professional smart people on TV and radio don't want to say it. Pathological liar. He's a malignant narcissist. And I would dare say he's on the scale, I've talked to psychiatrists who would agree, on sociopathy. For a villain, they're the hero in their own story. Who history will be the hardest on are these quote-unquote never-Trumpers, these quote-unquote mainstream Republicans, because when I speak to them, I say, where were you when you saw this happening? Because Trump is the result of decades and decades of racism and anti-intellectualism and Christian bigotry on the part of the American right wing. So they enable it, but then when he finally emerges, they run away. And or they say, you know what, it's transactional, and he's giving us everything we want, so what the hell, we're just going to be quiet.
This is the funny thing, is he's not actually giving them what they want. I mean, certainly they can say, okay, well, after a year of desperate trying, they put together a tax bill that is now, as polls show, profoundly unpopular, but nevertheless would have been much easier to deliver, much easier to negotiate with literally any other Republican as president except for Donald Trump. I mean, this is a guy who screwed up the system over and over and over again. So this argument that, yeah, but he's giving us what we want, he is not. He is actually making the Republican goals much more difficult to achieve because of his rank incompetence. If you ask me why it is that people like Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan are kowtowing to him, it's because they are scared shitless. That's why. It's because when we speak of Trump's base, what we are talking about is a rabid, radicalized, violent group of white nationalists and extremists who are going to make anyone who in any way disappoints their dear leader pay with their careers. So it's fear that I think is motivating the GOP to, for instance, launch this extraordinary attack on the very credibility of the FBI, all because it seems to have bothered this man baby who is the president, even though it goes against the very foundations of what the GOP stands for. That's not because they have shared interests with Trump. That's because they are scared to death of Trump.
The long view about how this happened, it's like the equivalent, you're in an airplane, the airplane is crashing, it's spiraling down, so you want to survive, but you'd also need to ask questions about what was going on with the maintenance for all these years that the plane failed. So certainly we have a crisis of democratic institutions, a crisis of civic literacy. We have extreme right-wing Christian fundamentalism. We have, of course, the SPLC has done an excellent job documenting this. And again, the mainstream media has dropped the ball repeatedly because how dare we talk about violence by Christian nationalists and white supremacists. That's something that nebulous brown folks from the Orient and the Middle East do this. How do we grapple with the other element here? The failure of moral leadership, right? You certainly have some folks center and on the left who are trying to speak some truth to power. But what about across the political spectrum? Where are the moral leaders, folks in the public sphere to stand up and say, either using their religious perspective or their secular humanist perspective like myself, to say, this is unacceptable?
What I would say is that this failure of moral leadership has created a permanent stain on the United States and certainly on our government. I don't think we recover from this. I know that's an extraordinary statement to say. I think that there is still an opportunity to remove this man from office, if not in the next year and a half, certainly in the next elections. I think that there is an opportunity to sort of reverse some of the moral rot that has become sort of a fixture of our political process as a result of his election. But I don't think as a country we actually get over this. And this goes to what we were saying a little bit earlier. Partly the spinelessness of the GOP has to do with fear. But there's something else going on here too. And to be honest, it's something that only an immigrant like myself can truly give voice to. You see, I come from a country that was one country one day and a completely different country the next. Most people around the world have that kind of experience. Look at Turkey. 6 years ago, Turkey was a thriving, pluralistic democracy with freedoms of thought and religion, freedoms for minorities. Yes, it had certain problems. All countries have problems, but by no means was it the totalitarian, authoritarian country that it is today. That happened almost overnight. I think there's this mentality among a lot of Americans that our political system here is permanent. Well, hell, we've survived 250 years, so that means forever, right? I mean, this country, our democratic norms and our institutions are inviolable, that they are forever, nothing could ever affect them. Okay, so we have a fascist for president, but eventually he'll be removed from office, and we don't really need to worry about it because the system corrects itself. No, it doesn't. There is nothing extraordinary or unique or permanent about the American system. It is hanging by a thread right now. And it's very small decisions that may seem inconsequential at the time. For instance, a refusal to even consider the possibility of protecting the independent counsel's investigation from interference from a president who has openly said that he is going to interfere with it. Those little decisions create the possibility of a permanent crack in the system. And I think that most Americans just think that it's inconceivable, that it's impossible, that the system itself can be fundamentally broken because they don't live in that kind of world. But ask any immigrant to the United States, and we will all tell you the same thing. Nothing is permanent. Everything can fall apart overnight if you are not willing to do whatever it takes to fight for it. We in this country are one, I would say, 9/11 style terror attack from the end of the American experiment as we know it. And that's not an exaggeration. That's the reality that we face under this government.
I was speaking to one of the world's foremost experts on cults, and had a wonderful conversation. And he said, Trumpism meets the criteria for a cult. And he said he's been trying to sound the alarm. And he said you can go down the list: ideation of the leader, hostility to external information, exiling people from within the cult who want to tell the truth about the cult leader, the violence, the insularity. He said you can literally go down the checklist. And then you overlap that with, again, Christian